But with that, I think now you've seen multiple perspectives. Again, this is about how we manage sustainability and food security in the face of climate change. We'll open it up to the floor for questions for the panel. Yes?
Giles Aldroyd from the University of Cambridge. So it's a question perhaps for Cynthia, but maybe broadly to the panel. So in the net zero emissions projections for the UK, agriculture goes from currently being an emitter of 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions to about 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because all the other sectors come down, but agriculture stays much the same. And so it becomes proportionately much greater emitter and is only competing with aviation for being the major emission predictor in 2050. To me, that's incredibly disappointing because it implies that, we really can't innovate, particularly in agriculture, to bring those greenhouse gas emissions down. I'm just wondering from the IPCC perspective, when you project forwards to a better scenario in 2050, is it a similar prediction across the globe? And perhaps to the panel, I feel like if we're not really setting ourselves as a group of scientists ambitious targets to achieve in agriculture, we simply accept that emissions will expand, will continue, then perhaps we're just not really setting a sufficiently ambitious agenda for both technology and science and policy to work from.
Very good point. In the report, one of the main overarching findings is that land has an important role to play and in reduction of greenhouse gases. And the mega point was land can't do it by themselves, but all the land potential reductions, but that it needs to play a role. And that was, I believe, what I can call on Tim too to see if he agrees. But what the IPCC was bringing forward is that we can't just only do it in the fossil fuel reductions, that the land has to play a role as well.
Could I jump into, this is an issue that's concerned me and many people in my group for quite a while. And I didn't talk about it, but we've published on this and have other papers that are out in review right now looking at this. There are many levers that can greatly reduce agriculture greenhouse gas emissions. Efficient use of nitrogen, which maybe Phil will talk about later, can greatly reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that gets in the air, which is right now 10% and heading toward 30% of global emissions. Dietary change that gets rid of ruminants has a huge benefit. Closing yield gaps so that we don't need to clear much land. About 10% of current global greenhouse gas emissions come from land clearing. If we can get rid of that, we can also do a lot. Beyond that, I don't see any way we'll get agriculture to zero emissions, but I do think we could have much lower emissions in the future than we have right now, probably half what we have right now, with some dietary changes and some greater efficiencies in use of inputs.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyone?
Can I chip in?
Oops. Yes, please do.
It's Tim Lang here. Yeah, I agree with that very much what Dave just said then. The critical issue, the data suggests we've got to do it mainly through consumption. And that's why we ended up doing that in the Lancet and why indeed it had such a big reaction, public reaction, as well as policy reaction. But, Cynthia said it, it's about waste and consumption change. That's the critical issue. I don't think agriculture should feel bad about that. Throw it back to you. What's the problem about agriculture not reducing? The whole point of agriculture is that it is altering ecosystems. It is emitting. The issue is just to cut that down in terms of waste. So what's the problem there?
So
Silence.
David Tillman mentioned that yields were stagnating, like in India and sub-Saharan Africa, and perhaps nothing can be done. I think soil organic matter content of those soil is so low, 0.1%, 0.05%. It can be and should be reversed, and yields will be improved. Cynthia, your comment that climate change is affecting food security by temperature and rainfall, climate change is also aggravating soil degradation, especially by erosion. And we must pay attention to that. Salinization as well. The last comment, again, back to David, whether agriculture can be emission neutral, both soil organic carbon and soil inorganic carbon. Inorganic especially, because 50% of the global land area will be arid, are very important to consider to achieve zero emission.
Okay. Yeah.
So, Michael Lee, Rothamsted Research. Just a comment that the complexity that we face is huge, and sweeping statements such that David made that getting rid of all ruminants is a potential suggestion I don't think is particularly helpful within this. I think we all agree that we massively need to change our diets and the amount that we consume. Particularly in the UK and the US, we consume way too much livestock products and processed foods, and there isn't a sensible, sustainable livestock scientist who wouldn't appreciate that. But we also need, and this is a plea to all the scientists, and I'm delighted that I'm such company, some fantastic scientists in the room, but this is a plea that when we're looking at nutrition, we look at nutritional quality within all our extrapolations. We need to include dietary quality, and particularly the fact that livestock products are more environmentally damaging, but they do produce a higher quality product. So when we're looking at the assessment of the nutritional value, we need to include protein, quality, DAS scores, the latest findings, and also micronutrient composition. And we need to stop over-interpreting the Eat Lancet report that didn't fully include the full nutritional value of those foods. We really do need to have science about the true baseline that we need to get livestock products for, because they're all going to have benefits. And ruminants do have benefits in utilising land and byproducts that we could otherwise not use. And also we heard the fact that we're facing a position with crops that we're going to have lower micronutrient and protein values as the planet warms. And therefore, the role that livestock will have in providing higher quality amino acids and micronutrients needs to be fully respected. I think Cynthia mentioned the impact on pasture, which is really interesting. And actually, in terms of livestock, that could be beneficial, because as long as we're not reducing between 5 to 6% crude protein in pasture, ruminants aren't going to be limiting in nitrogen. In fact, we're looking to breed clovers with lower nitrogen content to improve nitrogen use efficiency. So actually lower nitrogen and lower protein within forages could be beneficial to improve nitrogen use efficiency in grazing systems. So we think we need to readdress the role that ruminants play. Yes, we need to consume less of a higher quality, but I don't think the discussion around complete removal of livestock is helpful or beneficial.
So I'd like the panel to respond to that.
I will have a comment. I remind my friends who are vegans, especially those who have children, that no plant has B12 in it, and plants are low in iron, and that beef is something which is high in B12 and high in iron and can be part of a healthy diet. I would say the Eat Lancet report, which I was a part of also, included red meat as part of the diet, but it wasn't a lot of it, but it was the amount determined by some very good nutritionists to be what provides the B12 micronutrients, et cetera, that would be a part of a healthy diet.
But it included bioavailability. That was the big issue. And it didn't include DAS score in terms of amino acid bioavailability and indigestible essential amino acids. It didn't include any of that.
Well, the main person to do that will be here tomorrow, I believe, and you can have that discussion.
Excellent.
You might enjoy it. But your discussion about protein, almost no nutritional work suggested even the people who are malnourished are getting insufficient protein.
True.
So
I agree.
mentioning meat and protein, I think, is a good advertising ploy, but it's not much on the science side.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Or
Just to say, much of what you're saying was very much discussed and brought forward in the discussions in the IPCC. There were authors, scientists from animal production systems who were making very similar points to what you did, what you were making, what you just made. And in the IPCC chapters, we did try to be balanced and bring forward these. It's a more nuanced look, I would say, than perhaps other reports might have done.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I will comment on that as well. It's such a complicated system, and there's no silver bullet. There's no way to solve this, and there's going to be winners and losers, multiple stakeholders with different value judgments. Trying to get all that into solutions to this is a challenge that we face, for sure.
Yeah, I just think it's really important that I'm not taking out of context here. I'm not saying that we should advocate the current levels of consumption. We need to significantly reduce our livestock consumption. But they can play a vital role. And in fact, the nutrients contained within livestock can improve the bioavailability of the plants that we consume them with. A small amount of essential amino acids from livestock will significantly improve the amino acid bioavailability of plants. So it's about whole diet solutions, not single product solutions.
Point well taken. Yes.
So I'm Susan McCooch from Cornell. I'm a plant breeder by training, and I'm just curious whether anybody has already pitched the idea that part of plant breeding for the next process, using all of our available tools, might help drive us towards plants, especially trees, that could help us sequester carbon. In other words, take a proactive role here. I don't think we're going to solve, or we're not going to be able to fill out that scorecard, but it seems that one of the things that agriculture seems to just feel squeezed, and I think there is a role for thinking more proactively about what could be done with genetics today to create trees that could be planted in forests to actually help us sequester carbon, and to think about forages that have very deep root systems that are quite perennial that could serve this dual purpose. And as we think about multi-cropping systems, actively pursue the goal of keeping carbon in the soil for a long, long time. And I feel like as our dairy producers in many of the parts of the world that will be slowly, I think, phased out with new diets, they will have land that they are going to be looking for alternate uses. And of course, there's new crops coming, but I actually think that in the role of genetic breeding for the future, it's not just the traditional food as always. I think there are multiple opportunities for us to think much more creatively, and that would give ag a much more forward-looking, proactive approach they could talk about. Our president here has talked about planting trees, but he's never talked about what trees to plant or what the use of that would be or what the actual driver would be for the farmer to make that choice. And I'm asking whether if we include some thinking like this, then I suppose along with that goes a whole other dialogue, and many of you are much better at this, thinking about this, but what would be the carbon credit response on the policy side to help us move such an idea forward? And it could really gain traction around the world because there could be breeding going on in the tropics, breeding going on in the temperate zones, breeding going on to replace some of the trees that are being burned in the Amazon. I mean, there should be something a little bit more, I think, more environmentally forward-looking, but clearly rooted in agriculture that gives people a kind of stake in that future.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Susan. I think that's an excellent point. I think that so Joanne Corey at the Salk Institute has got a breakthrough project designed precisely to develop plants that can sequester carbon. And I think we could add that to the list of grand challenges that I talked about. And just to reiterate the point I was trying to make, I think if we thought about having these plants that were sequestering carbon intercropped with our other agricultural systems, with crops that were adapted to growing in that type of system, I think it could be a win-win situation.
Yes, Pauline.
Yeah, thank you very much. I very much agree with you, and also David's answer. I think what is important is that this doesn't become a discussion in either or. I think it's part of a solution where there is the supply side and the diet side plus the carbon sequestering. It's not really my area of expertise, but I think it goes beyond, like, for example, trees sequestering carbon. And I was thinking about it when David mentioned the specific crops that might have suitability for a certain area. And in South Africa, we do quite a bit of research around indigenous crops and crops where we've kind of forgotten why they were so suitable for that area. But they seem to have all kinds of characteristics that increase their sustainability, suitability, and resilience in a certain climate. And I think so tree crops and providing food with that and sequestering carbon, indigenous crops and also wild foods, I think, is something that we really need to put into this discussion and might create all kinds of very sustainable solutions for further food security in areas that are massively affected by climate change.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
I think it's a good idea to have really trees to sequester carbon, but we really have to be careful. We have to have those trees that are indigenous to a particular area, because in the past, we had really useful trees that were introduced to different countries and that became invasive. So I think the idea is good, but we really have to be careful. And within even a given country, you can't just have one tree that will be applicable to the whole of the USA or Ethiopia or whatever. So I think the idea is positive, but we really have to be careful in introducing those trees that are adaptable to that particular area. I just want a little bit of carefulness.
Yes, please.
So, Don Ort, University of Illinois. I guess this question is mostly for Pauline, and so I've been curious over time, thinking about this issue of waste and changing the nutritional balance of our diet. And so my perception is that a lot of the food that we waste are the perishable foods. And so, David admonished us in the beginning that as we think about solutions, not to create problems in other sectors. And so by changing the nutrition to more fruits and vegetables, might we be increasing also the liability that we have for waste if those are the most, if they represent a large part of that waste?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for raising that. That is a really important one, and I think something that we really should consider. Of course, if we think about shorter supply chains and more local and seasonal produce, that would hopefully capture part of that. Because if the products are no longer coming from Costa Rica but from the farm next door, that might already reduce the farm to fork time that we are considering here. But I think there is a long way to go in terms of waste, perception also of, or understanding even of the best by date stickers and so on, food labeling. So there is a lot to gain, I think that, and I think Cynthia mentioned that also in her presentation, that is definitely one of the focus areas.
If I could jump in, there's also some entrepreneurial work finding ways to extend shelf life of fruits. I know there's a company that started out of University of California, Santa Barbara, that uses, I think, it's an extract of grape seeds from wine operations that have, I can't remember chemicals in them, but whatever they are, they basically dip fruit in it, and it about doubles its shelf life in a grocery store. And so I think there are ways to minimize that. But you are right, the meat is the least wasted of the foods that come into homes, and fruits and vegetables are the more wasted ones.
Can I come in? Very quick point.
Yes, Tim.
Yeah, just to remind us, rich society consumers waste huge amounts of food. A large amount of food is wasted in poor economies, but mostly near the land. But in poor economies, consumers waste very little. It's too expensive proportionally. So there's an income and class gradient and also location in the world. It's a critical issue. We always leave it out, but that's a fundamental issue. The data show that very strongly.
Agreed. Should we wrap it up, or do we have? We have 1 minute. Yes.
Hello, Rachel Warren, University of East Anglia. So clearly this is a workshop about agriculture, which is a terrestrial issue. But I think that the links between agriculture and fisheries also can be looked at beneficially. So that the footprint that agriculture has on marine systems, and I'm not talking about aquaculture here, although obviously that's an issue as well, but the question of the extent to which fish are used in the production of nitrogen fertilizers and how that whole issue can also greatly, if we address that, greatly contribute to planetary health, in particular in the context of the effects of climate change on fisheries and the health of the whole marine ecosystem. So I think this is another area where synergies and conflicts need to be looked at.
Comment, Dave?
I'd ask Phil, what proportion of the total N applied agriculturally comes from fish? Tiny? From fish meal? It may be used more in organic agriculture, would be my guess. Because it was a traditional fertilizer 100 years ago. But I don't know. I don't know the fish meal issue, so I'm glad you raised it. I don't know much about it.
Yeah, but your point's well taken, that we have to think about the whole agro-ecosystem, the whole system, if we want to find sustainable solutions. I think one of you mentioned trade-offs, right? If you have a positive effect in one part of the system, you don't want to have an undue negative effect on another part of the system. We need to make sure we consider the system as a whole. So, all right.
Not just agriculture. Not just agriculture, it must be the food system. Agriculture is now a small part of the food system. In the rich world, still it's a huge part in the poor world. It's really critical to not talk about agriculture, but to talk about agri-food system. The supply chain is just, all the value is off the land. Unless we get that, it distorts our messages and also distorts the sound.
Fair point.
A good sustainable source of phosphorus is animal bones or fertilizer.
So,
Good part of the circular bioeconomy.
yeah, that's right, circular economies. Okay, I think we should stop, so we have our break. Let's thank our panel.